Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our weekly discussion on Far Villages, Welcome Essays for New and Beginner Poets. My name is Abayomi Animashaun, and I'll be your host for the evening. Today, we're going to be talking about form. What is form? Why is a consideration of it necessary when we're writing poetry? In what ways has the consideration and utilization of form useful to poets of the past? In what ways can such consideration be useful to new poets today? So our panelists, who are also contributors to Far Villages, I'm going to hold it up. Far Villages, Welcome Essays for New and Beginner Poets. Our panelists, Jaydn DeWald, Stacey Balkun, Nathan McClain, Zoe Brigley, and Chaun Ballard will be taking us through these considerations in a variety of ways, in a variety of rich, wonderful ways that, as I was reading their essays when editing this anthology, I was just thinking to myself, oh my gosh, I wish I had all these in my arsenal when I was starting out. It would have saved me years. So we're looking forward to all the wonderful things they have to say about form. In terms of format, we'll have all our panelists discuss their essays for about 10 minutes each. And then after that, we'll open it up to questions. In the meantime, however, please feel free to use the chat box if you have questions. And then at the end of the discussion, at the end of our panelists' discussion, I'll be sure to read your questions also. Okay. So we're going to open our discussion with Jaydn DeWald. I'm going to read his biography from the anthology. Jaydn DeWald is a writer, teacher, jazz bassist, and the author of 3 limited edition chapbooks, The Rosebud Variations and Other Variations, In Whose Hands the Light Expires, and as counterpoints to this compressed mass, A Longing. His poems, stories, and critical essays have appeared in Best New Poets, Brilliant Corners, a journal of jazz and literature, The Collagist, South, a scholarly journal, West Branch, and many other publications. He's a PhD candidate at the University of Georgia. Thanks for joining us, Jaydn.
Thank you for that introduction, Abayo, and Diane, and everybody for getting us together, and to my esteemed presenters. It was a blast to read everybody's essay. So I'm going to read the first couple sections of my essay, which is titled In Praise of Constraints and Citing the Unexpected. It's in untitled short sections. But I thought maybe just because this is kind of a conversational event, I would say something about how I came to constraints in the first place. It's funny about that you said you wish you had these essays when you were starting out. It would have saved you time. I wrote this essay really because it was the kind of essay that I wanted to have read maybe a decade earlier. So I came to literature relatively late. I think I was 19, a student in community college. And I was trying to be a good student, you know. I was hearing these advice and suggestions, even definitions of poetry. and follow them. I'm thinking of something like Wordsworth's famous claim that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of emotions recollected in tranquility. I didn't understand the tranquility part. I certainly understood the spontaneous overflow of emotions part, you know, being a musician for one, but just a person in the world. So I probably spent about a decade, this is kind of an embarrassing confession. I probably spent about a decade, you know, buying some bougie journal and pen and walking out into nature, or, you know, getting my coffee in a quiet spot, I was trying to court tranquility. And so, but rather than kind of like ignite the fires of composition, everything just sort of died and stalled, you know. So nothing really came of that. In fact, looking back on it, I think tranquility was like actively preventing me from writing poems in the first place. So what I needed was not tranquility, I needed volatility, something to work with and against at the same time. And constraints just happened to be that thing for me that got it going, because it gave me rules, which helps one make decisions in the act of composition. But those rules also are kind of limit or boundary to push back against, you know, in the way like a jazz musician might challenge or antagonize the harmonic and rhythmic expectations of Western music or something. So I didn't really ever feel like a poet until I incorporated constraints. So, okay, I'll read a little bit. It's called In Praise of Constraints and Citing the Unexpected. There's an epigraph from Nona Casper's Language is a Box You Wear Over Your Head. Several years ago, I began to write poems whose lines were of uniform length. I must admit that in the beginning, this constraint constituted a poetic manifestation of obsessive compulsive disorder. I loved the way a poem composed of conventional spacing could, without resorting to justified margins, resemble a near perfect rectangle. But I also loved the contrast between the subjectivity of a poem and its objective appearance on the page. Even though most of my early attempts suffered as a result of this constraint, I often sacrificed words and images for the sake of satisfying a line length, I continued to write these rectangles obsessively. Then, after a month or so, I began to notice that when I was stubborn enough, when I had worked a line until I was pleased both with its length and its poetic value, this constraint was a reliable way in which to incite arresting, largely unexpected results. Like established formal constraints, rhyme, meter, syllables, etc., an arbitrary uniform line length could, I discovered, force a poet to go beyond normative language and familiar sensory experience. I was forced to explore the possibilities of a given line, and this often meant radically altering, not simply expanding or contracting, the language. Just as a line of Creeley's will, with his emphasis on the breath, say as much as it can or as little in the time given, so a line of mine attempts to say as much as it can or as little in the space given. This is slow, often tedious work. I wrote well over 10,000 words before I placed the final period on a recent 164-word poem entitled Ritorneo, or Landscape with X. Worlds apart, in short, from Ginsberg's famous dictum, first thought, best thought. Still, I very much enjoy my strange idiosyncratic constraint. It is an engaging game. There's nothing static about it. Indeed, my experiences trying to find lines of particular lengths have inadvertently become some of the most surprising and affecting of my poetry writing life. Importantly, though writing poetry can be a mental, emotional, and imaginative workout, to write with constraints is not simply to use and abuse a certain set of muscles. It is also to discover fresh, inventive ways in which to compensate for what's lacking, for the proverbial arm tied behind one's back. Despite the general slowness of the process, or perhaps precisely because of its slowness, the trick is to keep moving, to trust that movement in due course will end in discovery, or else to trust that movement is itself the discovery. The parallels with trends in 20th century art, particularly abstract expressionism, are striking. At a certain moment, the canvas began to appear to one American painter after another as an arena in which to act, wrote art critic Harold Rosenberg. And this, for me, for my rectangles, a canvas inside the larger canvas of the page, is generally the case. I write a lot and I discard a lot, but deletion is as active and as productive a gesture as writing itself. I simply keep moving, keep moving. Now, years later, continuing to work with rectangles, I've come to care less about the appearance of the poems, that is, line length uniformity, than the unexpected results this constraint incites. A writer is not so much someone who has something to say, said William Stafford, as he is someone who has found a process that will bring about new things he would not have thought of if he had not started to say them. In fact, I have come to rely upon this process as a means of igniting my imagination, of inviting the muse, of digging deeper, of losing and discovering in semi-equal measure the self. I suppose I am, in Denise Levertov's words, as enamored of the process of making as of the thing made. This essay will examine how certain other contemporary poets, Trong Tran, Christian Book, Charles Wright, and Harriet Mullen, have imposed a variety of similar, seemingly arbitrary constraints to alter in a variety of unexpected ways their own poetry. And maybe just looking at the clock, which is a kind of constraint, I should probably move on to the next panelist, but thank you.
Thanks so much for that, for talking about this essay. Because what you're really saying is that we don't need to be afraid of form, which is what my reaction and my thought was when I was starting out. Oh my God, I don't want to have anything to do with it. Free verse, that's the way to go, you know. And what you're saying is there's no reason for us to be afraid of form. In fact, we can go on ahead and create our own forms and see what happens, having one hand tied behind our backs and just like having fun with that. It's freeing in so many ways. So thank you for that. So next we're going to have, if I'm right, Stacey Balkun. And I'm going to read Stacey's biography. Stacey, I don't know if I can pronounce the title of your first book. I'll do the best I can. So Stacey Balcoon is the author of Iper Si Muy, Jackalope Girl Learns to Speak, and Lost City Museum. Winner of the 2017 Women's National Book Association Poetry Prize. Her work has appeared in Crab Orchard Review, The Rumpus, Muzzle, Bayou, and others. Chapbook series editor for Sundress Publications. Stacey holds an MFA from Fresno State and teaches poetry online at the Poetry Barn and the Loft.
Awesome, thank you. Thanks, Jaydn, for that, and thanks everyone for joining us. So reading this section of the book on craft and form, something that stuck out to me was how everyone in this section sort of circles around this pull between freedom and constraint, like we just heard about, and using these as ways to get started and as ways to find distance from our subject matter. And I'm really interested in chatting through this later because we all seem to approach that from different ways. So I'll start by reading the first paragraph of my essay in here, which begins with a couple of quotes that maybe we can consider. The first is from Andrew Lang, and he says, "Nobody can write a new fairy tale. You mix up and dress up the old stories and put the characters into new dresses. the second from A.E. Stallings is, you have to fight magic with magic. You have to believe that you have something impossible up your sleeve. And to echo something that was said earlier, I wish I had these from the start when I first started reading and writing, because there's something so freeing about knowing you don't have to make something up. You can mix and match. You can, I mean, this is what musicians do too, right? We make remixes, we visit the same notes, the same letters, the same words, and there's a freedom in that, which is terrifying. But also it allows you to sort of step back and remember that it doesn't have to be you on the page. It doesn't have to be a confession. It can be a story. And whereas some of the other speakers will talk more about form, I'm talking a little bit more about subject matter here. So here's the intro to fairy tale as transformative poetics. Fairy tales offer poets not only language, form, and familiarity, but also structure, making them the perfect starting point for new poets. Fairy tale language offers safe passage into the realm of the imaginatively possible, as well as a chance at transformation of the tale, the timeline, the speaker, the setting, the diction, or even poetic form. When a reader hears "once upon a time," or "there was once," a new door is opened, a new expectation is set, preparing readers for this magical and priming them for a leap. So it can follow up a line like "once upon a time" with anything from "a jackalope girl brushed her teeth" to "once upon a time Gretel went to the mall." And there's already this established familiarity for the reader, right? And the reader will not be surprised by whatever magical thing has happened, because the first few words have already stated that we're no longer in Kansas. As in fairy tales, the fantastic can enter naturally, and the rest of the poem can rise to meet it, altering or destabilizing reality to allow for an emotional resonance, using not only the content, but the form. Kate Bernheimer names 4 elements of such fairy tale form. She says the 4 elements are flatness, abstraction, intuitive logic, and normalized magic, all of which can be used to transform. From incorporating these elements to embodying a familiar character, or letting a little magic seep into the logic of our fabricated worlds, fairy tales can teach us how to make poems. And I write teach there, but in a way I think I mean permission. They give us permission to tell our stories, either as ourselves or as somebody else, as Gretel, as a magical being. And I think, especially for new poets, that can be incredibly freeing, because there's this sense, I'm sorry, my dog's probably making so much noise. There's this sense that you're being vulnerable, right? And I can't wait till, I think Zoe talks about vulnerability. But by kind of turning back to these other stories, these other characters, it's not necessarily our vulnerability that we're putting out there. And I'll read just one more section and then we can move on, because I really want to talk with everybody about this. But I end by focusing on some of the different ways that we can do this. So we don't need to retell an entire fairy tale or to write a fairy tale poem, but we can consider its elements as a diving board to get started. Could a taste of normalized magic or twisted logic free us from the pressure of a blank page? Could using a familiar character as a persona be a fruitful exercise for poets unsure of where to begin? I'm convinced that if we look at fairy tales as a method of transformation, of moving from that blank page to a fresh poem, telling a familiar or an unfamiliar tale, either in a magical setting or in that familiar domestic setting, with characters who may be well known, or maybe just our own simple selves, our poems can be fresh and unique right from that very first. Thanks so much.
So one of the things that I love about this essay is that you mentioned how there's form to fairy tales, and you go on ahead and list the four components that you're referencing from the particular author. And before reading that, I'll be the first to admit that I just thought that you just did whatever you wanted to do, that it was just space where you just did whatever. I never thought that there was actual form. So this was very informative in that regard. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that during later on in the session. Our next speaker is Nathan McClain. And I have Nathan's biography here, and I'll go ahead and read it. So Nathan McClain is the author of Scale, the 2017 Gregory Pardlow Frost Place Poetry Fellow, and a recipient of scholarships from the Sewanee Writers Conference and the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. His poems and prose have recently appeared or are forthcoming in New York Times Magazine, Academy of American Poets Poem a Day, The Rumpus, Upstreet, and Tinderbox. He teaches at Hampshire College.
All right, thank you so much, Abayo, and thanks for everyone for just your presence here this evening. It's so great to see so many friendly faces and to meet some new ones. The essay that I had accepted for this particular publication is part of a larger and a much longer essay meditation that I was writing about what I thought I was writing about poetic closure, but in actuality, it seemed as though I was really writing about structure. And I think this was an essay that sort of like fooled me into, I thought I wanted to investigate the ways that poems end, and I believe that the essay does that. But really, I was investigating how poems get to their endings, which meant interrogating where a poem starts and what comes after that and what comes afterwards, and what makes endings of poems surprising and inevitable, as I've so often heard it said. So this essay really just goes on a deep dive and looking at Elizabeth Bishop's poem, The Bite. If you don't know The Bite, you absolutely should read it. It's among my favorite of her poems. And so I'm just gonna read just a few paragraphs from the essay itself that, and I might jump around a little bit, that talk about just the way in which she moves through the poem. She's like the patron saint of my soul. This is Bishop. But the essay itself is called Bishop's Glances. And I'm just gonna start at one paragraph in. One recognizes that Bishop doesn't simply see in a poem, she actively watches. Bishop is a poet of vantage, and vantage is always shifting in her work. The Bite features one of the most memorable of Bishop's endings. Quote, all the untidy activity continues, awful but cheerful, end quote. But what makes this ending surprising and necessary? The Bite, with its odd but salient epigraph, on my birthday, which I thought was odd and strange, enacts this business of actively watching. But the poem's ending is successful. But if the poem's ending is successful, looking back, what makes it so? Is it that the poem's ending culminates in this kind of subjective looking? Rather than focus solely on the poem's ending, I believe it necessary to closely examine the poem's entire structure to determine what makes Bishop's ending successful. One way Bishop creates this sense of watching in The Bite is by utilizing detail and image, which is really all the essay sort of like goes on to discuss it at length. Detail, to my mind, simply conveys information to the reader. Image, on the other hand, requires some additional information around or modification of the detail to transform the detail into an image. Therefore, the image gains nuance and has import. Detail can be made without image, but image cannot be made without detail. Bishop's opening sentence is a good example of image, of detail. Quote, "At low tide like this, how sheer the water is," end quote. Bishop's speaker presents information which is used both rhetorically and to contribute to the poem's tone. But what is also interesting about this particular detail is Bishop's use of syntax. I often expect to enter a poem encountering a normative arrangement of syntax, i.e. the declarative sentence, subject, verb, object. But Bishop inverts the syntax of the opening sentence. The noun or subject, water, and verb, is, are positioned at the end of the sentence. Therefore, the unexpected syntactical arrangement of this detail makes me curious about the emotional state of Bishop's speaker. It raises the question, why open a poem like this? The second sentence presents the poem's first image. Notice how the sentence begins, quote, "White crumbling ribs of marl protrude and glare, and the boats are dry," end quote, and how it ends, quote, "The pilings dry as matches," end quote. Like the opening detail, white crumbling ribs of marl is used rhetorically. It adds credibility to the poem's speaker, presumably Bishop. The image, the pilings dry as matches, is made through the use of simile. This early use of image in conjunction with the poem's opening detail only reinforced the implication that Bishop's speaker is not in a normal emotional state. We are forced to read on if we want to discover why. And I'll just read, just jump ahead just a little bit and read one last paragraph, and then we'll hopefully talk more about this. Of course, many of the discoveries made while discussing this poem thus far may not occur to a reader upon the first reading of the poem. This is why the poem's ending is so significant. Closure should lead a reader to reread the poem, since there is information in the middle, the importance of which we may not fully appreciate until we finish the poem. That sort of rereading can happen a number of times, and it is one of the reasons why the poet needs every detail in a poem to be purposeful, to have use. If a reader rereads the poem and discovers detail X has no real function, then the poem's credibility is placed in question. One reads a poem sequentially, moment by moment, until the poem is something that lasts X amount of time. But if the reader is to see the whole poem at once, as one picture, it requires a conclusion that sends the reader back into the poem. Thank you.
Thanks for that lovely reading, Nathan McClain. I really, Bishop was one of the poets who allowed me to, she was instrumental in helping me get something of a foothold in this crazy thing that we call poetry. Our next speaker is Zoe Brigley, and I'll go on ahead and read her biography. So Zoe Wrigley Thompson, originally from Wales, is assistant professor in English and Sexuality Studies at the Ohio State University. She has 3 poetry collections: The Secret, Conquest, and Hand and Skull. She is editor of Feminism, Literature, and Rape Narratives. Her first collection of essays, Notes from a Swing State, is out, was published last year. Most recently, her poems have been accepted by Chicago Review, Coppernickel, Australian Book Review, Orion, and Poetry Ireland Review.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah? I'm so glad to be here, and I'm really enjoying these talks. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm talking about my chapter, which was called On Dream Work and Not Confessing. And this came out of a challenge that I found in working with new and beginning writers. And the question of how to write about difficult and painful material without exposing yourself? I think this is the question. And this essay, there's really a story behind this essay, as there always is, which is the fact that I myself experienced intimate partner violence at 15. And I got to the age of, say, 21, and I had a lot to say. I had a lot that I wanted to write about, but I wasn't ready to write a confessional poem. And later on, when I started working with my own students, I took these ideas about dream language and dreams into the workshop. And I would find that it would always have a really remarkable effect, that people would write these incredible poems, which would not necessarily tell you anything personal about themselves, but which would actually give you a feeling about what was going on in the poem. And you would get a sense of what was happening without them having to tell you anything that was especially personal. And so I dedicated this chapter really to thinking about that. And I'll just read the intro, and then I'll show you something that I often show my students to introduce them to thinking about dream work. So here's the beginning of the essay. In the autumn of 1921, a young man waited nervously in the waiting room of Dr. Sigmund Freud's Vienna office. On finally being admitted, the young man talked awkwardly with the doctor about poetry, about the power of dream language and its possibilities for humankind. The doctor was perplexed, and before long he brought the conversation to a close, dismissing the young man and moving on to a waiting patient. That young man was André Breton, poet and founding member of the French Surrealist movement. Breton, who was introduced to Freud's interpretation of dreams during his World War I service as a psychiatric aide, remained fascinated by the idea of dream work, but he maintained a combative relationship with Freud. While Freud thought that the language of dreams could be used as therapy, Breton saw a potential philosophical key to the human condition. Inspired by free association, Breton created automatic writing, defined by Aaron H. Esmond as an entree to the wellsprings of creativity in the unconscious, and ultimately to the liberation of the individual from the constraints of bourgeois society. In dream language, Breton saw a remedy for human despair, and the use of techniques like automatic writing certainly allowed a fantastic escape from the mundane cruelties of everyday life. The commentary and workshop to be outlined here considers how worthwhile dream work might be for the writer who wants to represent trauma, pain, or violence whilst escaping an obvious confessional mode. So that's the introduction. And from there, I go on to think about the idea of confessional poetry, the confessional poets, and why do we want to confess? I think this is an interesting question. And reading over the essay again, I picked out something that I wrote down where I said, confessing might be the act of revealing oneself with the hope of receiving grace and forgiveness in return. Sometimes when we write a confessional poem, that we're looking for something like that, for some kind of grace. Something that worries me is what if you don't receive that? And especially if you're writing about something like, you know, violence against women or intimate partner violence, people don't necessarily want to hear these stories, and they don't want to know these stories. And how risky is it to, you know, expose yourself in writing about these things? And so I guess for me, for quite a while, dream language was a way of trying to write about these things without actually writing about them. And I think, like I said, that you can create a feeling, a sense of a difficult or traumatic event without actually telling it. And in the chapter, I talk about what Freud says about dream language, which is really interesting. And he says that there are actually two different types of dream work that go on in dreams. And one type of dream work is that's an amalgam of maybe two places that you know, or two people that you know. And Freud gives an example, and he says that he has a dream about a man who has the beard of one friend and the glasses of another. And he actually says that, in fact, this man is someone who he has quite strange feelings about both of these men, and men that he feels are a little bit threatening. And somehow in his dream, they become this kind of amalgam of two people who he both finds quite threatening. So that's condensation. And then the other type of dream work is displacement. And that's where something adjacent stands in for what you really want to talk about. And Freud describes this woman who has a dream about a woman who, a dream by a woman who's constantly thinking about climbing up and down stairs. And Freud breaks this down, he analyzes her, and he says, actually, what this woman is dreaming about is class. She's thinking about social climbing. And this is what she's really, really dreaming about. Although I don't know whether we trust Freud or not, you know, depending on your view of him. And really what he's talking about is metaphor and metonymy. That's basically what he's talking about. And I just wanted to show you a clip from a film that I use in workshop to just reveal and to illuminate this idea of dream work. And the film is Spellbound. It's Hitchcock, a 1945 film. And it's the story of a man who loses his memory after a murder takes place. He's the main suspect, in fact. And the film is trying to work out what actually happened. They decide after he has a very vivid dream, and that this could be the answer to finding out what really happened. So what I want to do is to show you this clip and maybe talk a little tiny bit about it before we pass it on. So here he is, he's about to have his dream analyzed. And I should say as well that the dream sequence is really wonderful because the sets were actually designed by Dali. So let's see what he says.
I can't make out just what sort of a place it was. It seemed to be a gambling house. But there weren't any walls, just a lot of curtains with eyes painted on them. A man was walking around with a large pair of scissors cutting all the drapes in half. And then a girl came in with hardly anything on and started walking around the gambling room, kissing everybody. She came to my table first.
Did you recognize this kissing bug?
I'm afraid she looked a little like Constance.
This is plain, ordinary, wishful dreaming. Go on.
I was sitting there playing cards with a man who had a beard. I was dealing to him, and I turned up a 7 of clubs. He said, "That makes 21. I win." When he turned up his cards, they were blank. Just then, the proprietor came in and accused him of cheating. The proprietor yelled, "This is my place, and if I catch you cheating again, I'll fix you." I'm sorry about that kissing bug.
I'm glad you didn't dream of me as an egg beater, as one of my patients did.
Why, what would that mean?
Never mind.
Well, does it make any sense to you what I dreamed?
Not yet. You were trying to tell yourself something. What it is, we'll figure out later.
There's a lot more to it.
Go on and try to recall the details. The more cockeyed, the better for the scientific side of it.
He was leaning over the sloping roof of a high building. It was the man with the beard. I yelled at him to watch out. Then he went over, slowly, with his feet in the air. And then I saw the proprietor again, the man in the mask. He was hiding behind a tall chimney, and he had a small wheel in his hand. I saw him drop the wheel on the roof.
So I'll just stop it there. But I remember watching this film as a child and being absolutely stunned and amazed by it. And it's stayed with me ever since. And what's interesting about it is that you could spend quite a lot of time unpacking all the symbolism of the dream and trying to work out what's going on there. But I think the thing that I find really inspiring about it is this sense that you can disguise experiences. And I think this is what really stayed with me, this idea that you could disguise things and create a feeling of something without having to actually tell what had happened. And this was almost like what was happening in this dream sequence. And I'll just tell you a couple of the things that so you can see how the film interprets the dream, which is quite funny. So, you know, for example, the win with 21 at cards is a displacement of a place, the 21 Club, where John Brown visited with the murder victim. Later on, there's a pair of wings, which is a displacement for another place, Angel Valley, where the murder actually took place. And there are other things as well, but particularly the wheel. What we find out is that the wheel actually stands in for a revolver and the roof for a ski slope. So they sort of interpret all these signs, and the dream is actually the key to solving the whole murder. And I loved this idea as a child, and I think it came back to me when I was reading about dreams and trying to think of ways of writing about difficult material, but, you know, without actually talking about it in an open way, without having to be realistic or to expose myself. So in the chapter, there's a workshop idea related to this, but I'll stop there so that I don't run over my time.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Our last panelist, definitely not least, is Chaun Ballard, and I'll go on and read his biography. Raised in Missouri and California, Chaun Ballard is an affiliate editor for Alaska Quarterly Review, a Callaloo Fellow, and a graduate of the MFA program at the University of Alaska at Anchorage. For 8 years now, he and his wife have been teaching in the Middle East and West Africa. Chaun's chapbook, Flight, is the winner of the 2018 Sunken Garden Poetry Prize through Tupelo Press. His poems have appeared or are forthcoming in Anomaly, Borderlands, Texas Poetry Review, Chiron Review, Columbia Review, Frontier Poetry, International Poetry Review, Pittsburgh Poetry Review, Rattle, and other literary magazines. His work has received nominations for both Best of the Net and a Pushcart Prize.
All right, thank you very much. This has been wonderful. I've been furiously taking notes over here, which I'm not sure if that was what I was supposed to do, but I felt like I was getting a lesson. And so I'll take a free lesson. So I appreciate that. And yeah, so I'm gonna read my excerpt here breaks down to like 4 different sections. So I'll read 2 of those sections. And then I guess we'll get to having those questions afterwards. So my essay is titled Peas in the Pocket, the Practice of Fixed Poetic Form. I took that title from my father-in-law, who used to hide peas in his pocket because he didn't want to eat them at dinner. So he would put them in his pocket. And eventually what would happen is when his mother would do the laundry, they would come floating up, right? And so I kind of stuck with that, because for me, that's what poetry was. I would try to slough it off, put it somewhere else, and then eventually I had to come face to face with it. All right, so I'll start with the second section, and it's titled Becoming. Becoming. In the book of Genesis, the author says that the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters. And out of nothing, God created the world. For me, form, poetic form that is like following in the footsteps of God. Like God who employed the already made dirt and dust to create humankind, poets can use the grains of form to create something new, something beautiful. We as poets hover over a blank sheet of paper with the desire to create something living and vivid. We want our creation to tell a story. We want to bear witness to the beast in the field, the fish in the sea, and the birds in the air, literally and figuratively. We want our waters to produce land, but most importantly, we want them both to be teeming with life. Exploring form gives me the opportunity to be in conversation with a community of poets, both past and present. And by reusing structures that had long been in circulation, I follow in tradition. Of course, form alone cannot make a poem successful, just as creating a landmass out of water does not make a planet teeming with life. There must be other elements present and working in unison. Poetic form is simply the bare bones, the structural foundation, the broken branches along the flattened trail of grass our minds and hands follow down the page. Or as poet and Professor Zach Rogow writes in his entry titled Using Poetic Forms, Part 4 of the Ghazal, on his Advice for Writers blog, quote, "Sometimes form is exactly what you need to give shape to the feeling or idea. The form becomes a perfect container to hold what's teasing your mind," end quote. As writers, our minds are often filled with sound bites and images from life's experiences. To me, it is important to organize these thoughts, especially when I am unsure of the direction a poem should take. Form is that container that aids me. It is that reusable, ever-trusty tool in the shed that can build a house, a fence, or any other structure that needs to exist. 3, why form? Poets write in fixed form for a variety of reasons. The ability to write in fixed forms afford me the opportunity to explore various poetic techniques, such as meter, rhyme, and repetition. In addition, fixed form also allows me an opportunity to distance myself from emotionally charged subjects, to containerize ideas, play with line structure, divert from many of my natural hangups and tendencies, and participate in a dialogue with both contemporary and historical poets, as well as providing a free write kickstart. The ability of a poet to write in fixed form also displays discipline and a showcase of mastery. In Kwame Dawes's online essay, Suffering and Form, he states, quote, "Form is a necessary product of routine, a reflection of rituals of existence, the hallmark of which is dependability, predictability, and the familiar," end quote. In her article published with the Poetry Foundation, poet Rebecca Hazelton echoes Dawes's theory that form is a necessary product. She writes, quote, "When we think of mastery in poetry, one of the best ways to practice technique is to write in traditional form," end quote. As the popular adage goes, practice makes perfect. Hazelton adds, when we think of mastery, we think of practice. And when we think of practice, we often think of repetition. Violinists spend much of their early years running scales before their fingers automatically and thoughtlessly assume their proper positions on the fretboard. Ceramicists must learn to wedge clay and center the clay on the wheel before they can successfully make pots. Basketball players put in countless hours perfecting layups. Ballet dancers' toes bleed inside their pointe shoes, and swimmers crisscross the length of a pool countless times, hoping to shave milliseconds off their time. These examples Hazelton provides explain how mastering fixed form should play a significant role in the growth of a poet. In order to gain said mastery, poets must cultivate a routine that is grounded in the foundations of their skill and focus. These skills must be honed and sharpened repeatedly. For poets, this comes through the reading of other poets, corresponding critiques, and the composition of a number of drafts and revisions. Practicing fixed form develops the fundamentals of poetic structure and allows poets to play within the set guidelines, rhythm counting, rhyme finding, repetition, voltas, stanza structure, and more. As a former athlete and a poet, I understand the benefit of developing my craft. The same approach I take to sharpening my basketball skills, whether it has to do with dribbling, layups, or jump shots, is the same approach I take to writing poetry. As with any other art or discipline, poets must put in the time and effort. The result of this dedication to traditional forms will provide a foundation for innovation in the future. Hazelton further explains, many forms that sharpen skills are useful also in free verse. Forms with repeating lines such as the villanelle or the triolet, and I'll add the pantoum, helps train poets in the power of repetition and refrain in free verse, and how a phrase can be recast through shifting context. The ghazal, with whose couplets can operate autonomously, is a lesson in juxtaposition. The possibilities aren't limiting, they're endless. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chaun. Before we get into the question and answer session, I just wanted to say that during this month, and Diane Gettle is here, she can say more about this. During the month of, I forget what month we're in. Sorry, everybody. During this month,
September.
during the month of September, all print books at Black Lawrence Press are 40% off as a back to school kind of deal. I don't know if Diane wants to say something about that more.
Yeah, we are just having a big back to school sale over at the Black Lawrence Press site. It's blacklawrencepress.com or just blacklawrence.com. And I just posted the link to Far Villages. And if you are interested in picking up a copy, you can use Back to School 40 to get 40% off this anthology, any of our anthologies, any of our titles. And I will personally ship them to you. This is the Black Lawrence Press headquarters right here. I have stacks and stacks of books I would be delighted to send to your doorstep.
Thanks so much, Diane. All right, so in editing this anthology, I was humbled in so many ways, excuse me, because I realized that I started poetry the wrong way. I had all kinds of bad habits. Everything all these wonderful poets are saying, I did not do any of that. I did not pay attention to form. I did not pay attention to repetition. I was one of those poets who felt as if he knew what he was doing immediately. So I look back on it now and I'm just so ashamed at how I started, So my first question, please feel free to just use the chat box for questions. Feel free to ask questions on your own too. Let's have fun, please. So my first question is to Chaun. So Chaun, why is it that some poets, when they're starting out, like myself, when I was starting out, why are they so resistant to the repetition that you're talking about, putting in the work? And while not putting in the work, they feel as if they know what they're doing already, something you wouldn't see with a violinist, a pianist, a ballet dancer. Why is it that we see this with some poets when they're first starting out?
Yeah, I don't know if I have an answer for that, but I would use myself as an example. I simply didn't know what poetry was. And because I didn't know what poetry was, I thought just like everyone else, if I read a poem, I could write a poem, right? And I didn't really know how to read a poem. So I had a surface level reading, and so I wrote a surface level poem. And that's kind of how it worked for me. So yeah, I don't know exactly the answer for other people, but for me, I had to know more about poetry in order to produce the kind of poem that that others would understand and enjoy in the poetry community.
Thanks, Chaun. Is it okay if I open the question to our other panelists to see if they have thoughts about this, insights about this? If not, I can ask other questions too. Thanks, Nathan.
Yeah, I think similar to Chaun, I came of age largely in the deserts of California. I lived in Joshua Tree for much of my early young life and early adulthood. And where I went to school, I lived in this just a small town. And what I learned in school was, largely your canonical poets, generally your Shakespeare's, your Frost, many of those sort of like more either modern or canonical poets. And so I didn't even think that poetry was a thing that people did anymore. When I was growing up, I thought that we were, it was an exercise in reading sort of Dead Sea Scrolls, and that this wasn't a thing that people actually did at any point anymore. And so it wasn't until the first book of poems that I read by a living poet was a book called The Art of the Lathe by B.H. Fairchild. And it completely blew me away, not only because it was something that seemed so contemporary and so close to my own experiences, even though, this is an older white man who was writing about working in machine shops in Kansas, and I'm living in the desert of California. But it was something that there was something human about it that I could connect to. And I think early on, for me, it was just, I think it has a lot to do with access. I didn't have access to a lot of contemporary poets. And so my resistance, I think, to form was that it didn't feel like reading Shakespeare, reading Browning, reading Frost, many of those authors, when I came into contact with their work, it didn't feel to me the way that people spoke. And so I think that was some of my resistance to really working in form. I thought form was something that seemed a bit more archaic to my experience, which I think is something that affected me. I'm curious to hear of what others think.
You know, I find this conversation really interesting because I'm from Wales, and Wales is a country where poetry is fundamental to the identity of Welsh people, as you know, a very small minority culture. And so for me, I grew up in a culture where writing poetry was something that was very important that you did, and not just for yourself, but for other people, for your community. That was what you were supposed to do. So I feel like I have a slightly different take on it in that way. And I think that's something that I think is positive about growing up there, was that poetry was open to everybody. It wasn't seen as something that was just for elitist white people, that you could be like a poor working class person and write poetry. And that was something that was quite wonderful. But I think the question is an interesting one, that people tend to think that they can write a poem, you know, just spontaneously without having read much or anything like that. And maybe the best poetry is so good that you don't see the workings, if you know what I mean, that it's like, you know, some singers that you see sing, you know, they sing effortlessly and make it look easy, or, you know, yeah, thinking about musicians as well, where they make it look, you know, think about Jaydn, who plays bass, maybe because speechless, you know, that you could make it look, you know, incredibly easy to an outsider. When you actually come to do it, it's very different. So I think that's a really interesting question.
I'll try and add something to that. I think when I started, I was drawn to form because I was drawn to otherness or to alterity, and often that came in the form of something that was archaic. I was sort of like maybe like tired of my own voice, and I often didn't understand what I was reading, and that didn't matter either. It was its own kind of like maybe music or something that I was just kind of drawn to. And so form became a way to make the distinction between ordinary conversation, everyday speech, and something that was bigger. Of course, you know, there's always, now I like to think of poetry with a lowercase p, but still in the beginning, and maybe that's true for all of us, it has to feel really kind of big in order to get so invested in it.
I'm going to add something that is tangential to this, so bear with me. But when I was little, I didn't read poetry. I read The Boxcar Children. I loved talking animals. Anything that was like slightly magical, I was super into it. But then when we're taught poetry, oh, here's how to write poetry, sit down and write a poem, you're like, this is nonfiction. For some reason that's in our heads, generally, with my students at least, and with me as a young person, and it was like, I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know how my story that I didn't know how to tell could be written in a narrative poem. And it wasn't until reading a few different fairy tale and speculative poems where I was like, oh, this is my way in. But that was not for a long time.
Can you guys hear me okay? My computer is acting up, thank you. So is it okay if I put somebody on the spot? Danielle Wenger, I'm trying to read your commentary and it seems like you're asking a question, but I don't quite understand. Would you be willing to just ask, speak to your question a little bit for our panelists?
Yeah, I was just expressing my thanks around the various things I was hearing throughout the presentation.
Okay. Thank you. So, Zoe, I'm going to take this a step further and ask, So you're talking about, in your essay, you talk about confessional poetry, and you're saying that there are alternatives for beginning authors or beginning writers, beginning poets. There are alternatives to this. One of this is dream work. And when I was reading the poem, and even now, the essay, and even now as you're talking about it, I was thinking not just confessional, but representational as well, right? Representational poetry. Why is this so appealing to beginning poets? You mentioned the need for grace and redemption. Is it also true for representational poetry as well?
So are you saying that new and beginning poets you think they like representational poetry or not?
Right, that's what I'm saying, that it's...
You're asking me.
what is so appealing about this, that this is where, I know for me, that's where I started, you know, oh, look, I'm going to paint a picture with words over there and talk about this thing over there. Why is that? Why do poets begin, many poets begin that way? Of course, not all. Why do many poets begin this way? What's so appealing about this kind of representational, confessional approach when first starting out?
Well, I think there is, like I was saying, there is this sense of like writing poetry in a way to get some kind of response, or sometimes approval, or, you know, forgiveness or acceptance. And it seems to me that it is very understandable why people would turn to poetry for that. You know, that there's a big tradition of poets, you know, sort of probing their wounds, and that can be actually a source of power, because if you display that yourself, if you make yourself vulnerable, it can be really strong. It can be a kind of power move, actually, and you see that in the confessional poets. And I think that often new and beginning poets are sometimes the things they're writing about, not always, but sometimes they're trying to reclaim things. They're trying to find a sense of their own power about things that have happened to them. And that seems to me to be completely understandable. And yet it also might be very frightening. And I suppose what worries me about my own students is they might find that they write these things and it's you know, it's very exposing, and you might not get the approval that you're expecting. You might not get the grace. You might not get the redemption, because you know, the fact is the world is what it is, isn't it? And some people you'll find who will be your readers and who will understand what you're talking about. And I feel like I've got to a point now where I can write about it in a, you know, more representational way. But I couldn't have done that like 15 years ago, say. I could not have done that, because I don't think I felt the trust that people would take it the right way. And so I really try to protect my own students from that until they're ready to tell their stories the way that they want to, because you know, you just don't know whether you'll get that grace in the end. And so I think that's part of why I wanted to write this chapter, was to say, you know, you don't have to do that if you're not ready. And there are other ways to write about these things if you need to.
Wow, that's just amazing. Okay, my head is just exploding right now. All right, that really helps me. That really helps me, but it helps me understand. I'm trying to go back and have this kind of beginner's mind when I first started out doing this thing. And it helps me, what we're talking about here is helping me understand what I was looking for and what I was so resistant against. So not only was I looking for this kind of redemptive kind of a thing, this redemption, but also I was, when I was starting out and was being difficult with teachers, I was also putting up walls so that if people rejected it, I would be like, oh, you know, I would have something to come back to. So that's really, really helpful. Thank you so much. Wow, okay. Does any of our other panelists want to add thought or say a thing, I think we can move on to.
I have a question. Well, I was thinking about Nathan's essay on Bishop and how it might relate to Zoe's essay. I mean, I know Bishop's early work had a kind of surrealist bent, but you know, the way in which she describes something, or when she describes something, she's saying as much about her own psychological state as she is the bite or whatever she happens to be describing in the poem. Is she also doing something like akin to that translation that you talk about, Zoe, in your essay?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I'm just holding two thoughts in my mind because I was just replying to Heather as well. Because I was just looking in the chat and Heather was talking about, sorry to interrupt what you were saying, I'm just trying to, I'm doing two things at once. And Heather was talking about confessionalism and that actually there's a lot of artfulness and craft in it. And I completely agree with that actually. And something I write about in the chapter is that actually this is really downplayed in a way which I think is really damaging to perceptions of confessional poets. But because I was sort of thinking about two things at once, could you tell me that question again? I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I was thinking about the way in which when Bishop describes the bite, for instance, as Nathan like really, you know, clearly articulates in his essay, she's really saying as much, if not more, about her own psychological state. And so do you see that, even though it's not very surrealist, it may be surrealist in other Bishop poems, do you see her on the page like doing that kind of translation into dream work or something adjacent to dream work? Yeah, just your thoughts on that.
I love that question. But, you know, I mean, what do you think, Nathan? I feel like it could be definitely that you could sort of use nature that way. And I think it's something I'm interested in myself, that I've moved towards, more towards thinking about a kind of displacement onto nature. But what do you think?
I would definitely say that I think there's similarities to what I think is accomplished in, say, what Stacey was writing about with fairy tales and what you were writing about and thinking about dream work. I think one of the things that I was at first frustrated about with Bishop, but came to really admire, is the way in which she is able to have such control over how much access she allows to her speakers. And I think that that's also something that's being accomplished with dream work, and something that's being accomplished with the act of writing through the lens of fairy tales or through the lens of fables, is that you get to control the level of access that you allow your readers. And it's part of the reason my students are constantly frustrated with Bishop, because they are always thinking like, what does this even mean? She's just writing about looking at some water. What does that have to do with anything? And not looking at any of the ways that she's creating images, using simile, using adjectival modification, using metaphor to allow us various degrees of access. When we in the poem that I write about in the essay, it isn't really until you get to, like, all of her images are really rough and kind of volatile. Many of them have to do with severing, but then you get to these wonderfully tender moments where she compares these boats to these torn open, unanswered letters, which seem so different from everything else that she's written about. And you realize that the poem seems to be, that the poem is so much more closer and so much more personal to her, and what she's really dealing with, aside from the frustration of having to write a poem, is that she's dealing with like the fallout of some relationship as well. But she's not comfortable just saying that. She has to sort of she has to control how much access she gives you. And I think that they're very much doing similar things. I don't know if you would agree with that, Zoe, or you, Stacey, as well, with sort of that kind of work.
Yeah, I'm not sure how where I'm going with this yet. I was rereading a bunch of her poems last week, and what stood out to me was how often she just awful or terrible, the terrible train, the awful noise. And I feel like there's a connection there. There's all these detailed descriptions, as you talked about and wrote about, Nathan, but there's also these moments of just that are so broad. Like, what does that mean to each different reader? Terrible noise. And I feel like that does open a little door into a little bit of surrealism, or asks us to do a little bit of that fantasy work on our end.
So we have a question. I'm going to read as a statement before it, and then there's the question. So it goes, it seems that there's currently a widely held understanding that if a poem is not obviously a persona poem, it's automatically autobiographical / confessional. So I wonder if part of it is because we need ways to signal the breaking of the rules of reality in seeking to communicate moments of trauma, fracture, etc., in a safe way.
I'll just jump in and just say that I would argue that I would argue that all poems, to some extent, I think, are autobiographical. However, the caveat that I always like give my students, because they're always terrified by that. They're like, I don't want you to see me, but at the same time, I want you to see me. But the caveat that I give them is that not all of this biography or autobiography is necessarily narrative. So that, and you know, like even with Bishop, I think Bishop teaches us, and many of the things that we, you know, which is why I encourage my students. I'm like, go live your life, go be young, go do stupid things, go make mistakes, because this is, or go fall in love, go swing in a tree, because where we draw our details, how we make images, how we build metaphor, we pull all that out of our lives, which is like, I can teach someone how to, you know, how to write a good sentence, but I can't teach them living. And that's where they have to draw the materials for their work.
I'll just add too that like Bishop is one of those poets where when she says I know she's talking about her. And I think that's pretty generally accepted. I don't always equate the I with the poet, him or herself. Just wanted to add that.
I just love this conversation. I wish we could just keep going. I just love it. I just love it. Stacey, I'm going to come back to you a little bit, because like I said, I love this idea that there's form to fairy tale, and you mentioned a few of them in your essay. Rapunzel was one of the ones that you mentioned in your essay, and so on. So what, from your experience, what stories do you see, if you've seen any, do you see poets gravitating toward the most, and why are they gravitating to as much?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think immediately of Little Red Riding Hood. I feel like, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the name of the book, but isn't that weird about Zoom? I feel like my brain just doesn't make that connection like it would in person. I would know the name of it, but because it's behind me, like I'm a bookshelf. But I feel like a lot of, and this is also limited by my focus and research, right? But I feel like a lot of women writers focus on or pull in these tales where we have these kind of disenfranchised female characters. I feel like it's a way to explore what is expected of us, any writer, and ways to push against it. And I don't feel like I'm answering you at all. Is this Frances, Forrest, that book, she has a few Little Red Riding Hood poems in there, and I feel like she uses them to discuss the land in an interesting way too.
Oh, Stacey, please don't apologize about Zoom. Just a minute ago, I couldn't remember the month that we're in, so so please don't apologize. So we've been talking about form, and we're saying that, go out there with saying to beginning poets, and maybe to experienced poets too, who maybe they haven't used it in a while. We're saying go out there. What do you have to lose? Have fun. Create your own form. Use old ones. We're saying all these things. But I guess the question is, what kinds of difficulties? So looking at the other side of it, why people might be resistant. What kinds of difficulties might come with using traditional forms, and the kinds of forms that we create for ourselves to act as, this kind of self-imposing delineations that we're trying to experiment with. What kinds of difficulties come with them?
I would say maybe that with whether the form is received or the form is something that is being invented, one of the difficulties that I have seen, I'm actually teaching a course right now that's called Thinking Inside the Box, where we're only dealing with received form and talking about, and the workshop is just utilizing form entirely. But one of the challenges that I think some students have, I think, is with really thinking about how subject matter or how content and form are supposed to be, I think, for successful poems that really utilize form, how content essentially has to be form and form has to also be the content. Like for instance, before I moved to Massachusetts, I lived in New York for a number of years. One of the things that at the time, I'd sold my car in California and moved to New York. But one of the things that I noticed about being in New York was that everyone was frustrated all the time about other side of the street parking. And so at some point I ended up writing this villanelle, this villanelle from the vantage point or from the persona of Sisyphus, but yet the one task that he had was just moving the car every day. And that I felt like was at least an appropriate use of the form to like this obvious repetition that happens. And of course, the story of Sisyphus sort of does a lot of that work. But I think it's in that vein that the content and the form have to in some way sort of like be threaded and wedded together. And I think that's some of what the challenge is. It's like that sometimes form and the content are seemingly antithetical.
I kind of want to.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, who was that? I might be throwing. I kind of want to throw this to Jaydn, who Chaun was talking about form as an exercise, and Jaydn kind of pushed it a little further in his essay and said it's not just about moving certain muscles; it's about finding ways to compensate for what's lacking. And I'm really curious to hear more about that, if that fits into this conversation.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I was thinking like, I'm teaching this film class right now, and we're reading that Walter Murch book with Ondaatje, and he talks about taking a film like, I think it was The Godfather, and cutting it from 2 hours and 50 minutes to like 90 minutes. Totally didn't work. But when they built it back up, they realized what they could cut away. So constraints, which is what my essay is all about, is like kind of, let's see like what you can do with so little. Like lipograms, for instance, like let's just take away all the vowels except E, So if you're kind of frustrated at every compositional moment, choosing a single word, I think you're opening yourself up to lots of surprises. Now, you might be opening yourself up to lots of bad poems too, but occasionally, you know, if you push yourself hard enough, or, you know, like Christian Book, who spent 7 years writing Unoa, and it's not a very long book either, maybe you can get some pretty interesting stuff. But again, it's that whole idea of like, you know, courting otherness or alterity, and like allowing like a procedure to dictate your decisions. You know, I don't know if this dovetails with anything that we were talking about earlier.
Do you feel like, Jaydn, that I would imagine, just based on what you're describing, does that also kind of fall in line with kind of the tradition of like the sort of Ulipo poets, who are like poets who are writing in that sort of style and utilizing a lot of those constraints as well?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I discovered the Ulipo poets through Harriet Mullins kind of, you know, kind of adopting some of those practices, but also, you know, kind of challenging, you know, like that kind of French boys club tradition, you know, and saying that there's a way that you can bring all this other stuff, which is very deliberate, very different than chance operations, into. So it's a kind of combination of like personal writing and chance operations and composition on autopilot or something. Yeah.
But I was going to say, I think one of the things for new and beginning writers with form as well is finding the forms that work for what you want to write. I think that is the really significant and important thing. And so, for example, for me, recently I've been experimenting a lot with punctuation and thinking about how I can try and represent the difficulty of telling a story that is traumatic on the page through using that, and that works really well for me. And I love, Chaun, that in your essay you had a Welsh poet, Dylan Thomas, which is wonderful. But you know, that poem strikes me like almost like you were saying, of a poem where the form works so well to just really hold up the content and just support it and make it better. And all the different poems that you mentioned in that chapter really seem to speak to me of like that sense of the form being the right form.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I think I wrote about this in that essay, or maybe I took it out. I probably didn't add it to this one, but I didn't start writing poetry until I graduated from college. And that was my first introduction to poetry class. And that was an introduction to form. And so my first introduction to poetry was form. And so what I discovered during that time was that we had a variety of students in that classroom that were just like me. They had no idea what poetry was, what it could do. And when we were introduced to form, a lot of students, you know, they were in this hip hop stage. So they wanted to write a rap. And yet that rap sound very funny when put in certain forms. And so they eventually dropped the class. It wasn't what they were looking for, right? And so when I think about that, it's just as you said, if form, I think Nathan said that, if form marries content, then it's important to know what form will work best for that content. And if you don't have that knowledge, and I think a lot of students that are beginning poets, they may not have that knowledge. And so they may be, because they're less exposed to certain forms, they may not want to venture in that direction. And also the constraints will not allow for that freedom, right? And as I said, students that were writing raps, they really wanted to go a different direction, but those constraints would not allow them to. And it got to a point where the poem was very sing-songy. And when we think about form, the beauty of it is that you may not even know that it's in a form. right? Because if it's that successful, you may not even know that it is a poem, right? And that's what we're all shooting for. So yeah.
Nathan just posted something in the chat box. He says, many students, to include myself, want so much to write in free verse, but they often don't know what verse has been freed from. I think that's really insightful. That's what I did when I was starting out. It wasn't until I read that T.S. Eliot essay on free verse that I began to really understand, oh my gosh, I really need to pay attention here. Okay, can you guys believe that we've been talking for over an hour and a half? Doesn't it seem like we started just 2 minutes ago?
This has been so great.
I know. So, oh my, it's so painful. And they say poets don't have fun. I mean, I'm having a blast right here. Okay, so we have to try to wrap this up. So I'm going to put a question to all our panelists, and all our panelists have to answer this. Okay, so we've been talking about form, the plus side of it, the negative side of it, and so on and so forth. What form are you working on right now, whether received, self-imposed, and why?
I'll start. All week, I've been trying to write a duplex. Have y'all read Jericho Brown's The Tradition? Yes, I see excited hands. I think it's an invented form that he invented, which works kind of like a villanelle or a pantoum. And I started with a list of words. Clutch was one. Bound, fast, these 3 words. I was like, oh, they have so many meanings. I'm going to write a duplex about driving that's also about divorce. And that's how I got there, but I don't recommend starting this way. Now the stakes are very high, and I'm not sure where to go with it. But that's where I've been reading Jericho Brown. I've been thinking about the duplex. How about y'all?
I've been writing this very strange form that I've been calling a haiku, which is a really bad portmanteau, but it's a series of haiku whose lines repeat in the pattern of a pantoum, or almost a pantoum, because a pantoum's in quatrains and the haiku's obviously 3 lines. But then I take out all the punctuation and I put it in a prose block, like a kind of breathless prose block. And Chaun was talking about a poem that you don't know it's in a form. I mean, I think when you read these, you know it's in a form because there's so much repetition, but I think it would take a very discerning reader to understand, to count the syllables and, all that kind of stuff. But so I don't know, I've been doing a bunch of those.
I think for myself, I think I've largely been sort of more so thinking about like breaking out of form in some ways, and I've largely been writing a lot of much longer poems than I've been used to in previous times. A lot of my earlier poems, and I still enjoy writing shorter poems, but a lot of those earlier poems maybe they broke out of maybe 1 page if I was lucky, or it was something that was done in sections. But of late I've been sort of deeply interested in these longer, more sprawling poems, and I think a lot of it had to do with at least giving myself a kind of permission to be able to kind of like to take up space in some way, and to feel like that was, to take up space, to ask a reader for their attention, and to really sort of elongate a meditation or an utterance over a length of time.
Yeah, so the duplex, I've been working with some sonnets, and I've written a number of ghazals, and then I stumbled onto the duplex, and it made perfect sense, right? It's that what Hazelton says about phrases can be recast through shifting context. And it's beautiful to see how Jericho Brown builds this as he shifts all these phrases going down the page. And you feel that momentum, but it has those couplets like a ghazal that can exist autonomously, but it can still flow like a sonnet, and of course with that blues element. So it's really cool to see that. So keep at it. And one day I'll join. I'm not that brave just yet. I got some other things that I need to get over. But right now what I'm doing is I've been working with trying to build these side-by-side sonnets and cementing them together with a golden shovel. So yeah, so I guess it's kind of a sonnet diptych, I suppose, cemented with a golden shovel. And then I've been trying to play with the ghazal, and instead of having this refrain, I'm trying to embed it with an image instead of using the words. And I think Camille Dungy, she did this a couple times with her sonnets, in her book, What to Eat, What to Drink, and What to Leave for Poison. I believe that's the title. And so, yeah, I've been experimenting with those kind of things.
Great. And I wish I had more of a chance to talk to Stacey, because I'm actually working on fairy tales at the moment. And the fairy tales themselves are relatively traditionally written, but I've got these funny little marginal notes that I keep writing on them, which is almost like critiquing myself as I'm telling the story, and also sort of revealing things about my own sort of disquiet that I sometimes have about certain things in the fairy story, or things that I recognize or that I sort of relate to my own experiences. So I'm sort of trying to write very straight fairy tales and then kind of undo all the work I've done.
All right, everyone. Oh my word, it's so hard to say. It's so hard to bring this conversation to a close. It's so rich. It's so wonderful. But we've been going, it doesn't seem like it, but we've been going on for a while now. So thank you, panelists, for the wonderful discussion. I did not even feel as if I've been sitting down here for an hour, 45 minutes, to be honest. Thank you for your wonderful essays. I keep reading them again. They're helping me grow as a person, as a poet. They make me want to become a better person and a better poet. The conversation will go on next week, and we're going to have more people talking. I forget what we're going to be talking, what the focus is going to be, but we're going to have it. We have it listed on the book page on the Black Lawrence Press website. And Diane Gettle is going to be moderating next week's conversation. Diane, did you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, next week we'll have 4 of the contributors all talking about the poetry workshop. And I actually dropped into the chat box a link in case you're interested in registering. It's the same time next week. And also, I just wanted to mention there was a question from Lisa Roberts about if what people's favorite books are that are sort of introducing poets to different forms. I just want to point out the very back of Far Villages, we have 10 pages in very, very small font of all of our contributors suggesting exactly that kind of title. So that's a great place to start. And I am, yes, of course, plugging the sales of our very excellent anthology right here. So I think that's it for this evening. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you to Abayo for moderating tonight. And I have to say, this is really one of the best ones yet. I'm so invigorated, and I hope to see many of you next week. And I hope to do nearly half as good of a job as Abayo always does, running the events. So have a lovely evening. Thanks for everybody for joining us, and see you next time. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.